Hey guys, today we're in the book of Leviticus chapter 23. As we've been talking about this whole time in Leviticus, it's broken down into sections. We started out with the ritual sacrifices. Then we talked about the priest being ordained. Then we talked about what was ritual purity. And then we had the Day of Atonement. And now we started working our way backwards. We talked about moral purity. And then the last 2 days we talked about qualifications for the priest. And today we're in our last sections from 23 to 25 is about the ritual feast. So we had the sacrifices at the beginning. Now we have the feast at the end. And so today we just get a breakdown of these feasts. Now we've seen most of these feasts throughout our reading already. There's one that is new to us, but most of this we've seen. It's just God is putting them together, reminding them of what they are to do, right? Think about Leviticus. The whole thing is to be set apart, to be different, to be holy, to be clean. And so here, as he's finishing up this book on being set apart, he finishes with the feast. And this is how Israel will be different. And so most of this we can go through pretty quickly. Couple things I want to point out. We see that these are the feast of the Lord, and they shall proclaim holy convocation. Now, this idea of convocation means to assemble, to come together, and not just to assemble, but to assemble in worship. So these feasts are a part of worship. It's a time for Israel to come together and to worship. Another thing that these feasts do that we necessarily don't see as much now, but we will see as we read the Old Testament and even into the New Testament, a lot of these feasts are very prophetic. They're looking forward to something. They're to commemorate the past, but they are looking to the future. And another thing with these feasts they are all about gratitude. It's all about being in the right mind, in the right heart of thanking God for what He has done, what He is doing, and what He is going to do. And so we start off simply with the Sabbath, God telling them to remember that the seventh day is holy, to keep that. And then we see the first feast, and that is Passover. And we've read a lot about Passover, but notice it says Passover is the Lord's Passover, and then on the next day it starts the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, which is the second feast. So Passover is 1 day. The Feast of Unleavened Bread lasts 7 days after Passover. So Passover is one. The next day, the Feast of the Unleavened Bread starts. So they're two separate things, even though a lot of times they get pushed into one. They are two separate things in the Bible. And it's a holy convocation, so it's a holy time to assemble. The third feast is the Feast of the First Fruits. And you can see here in verse 10, it says, speak to the people of Israel when you come into the land that I give you. This is not to be celebrated until they come into the promised land, into the land of Canaan. So God is giving them something that they have to do in the future for the whole idea of being thankful that God is blessing them and giving them all of this food, all of this great abundance of crops that they necessarily didn't do anything for, right? So, because when they took over the promised land, they just took over everything and they got to reap other people's work, right? So that's what's happened. Number 4, the fourth feast is the Feast of the Weeks. We would call that today Pentecost, okay? Pentecost. And so basically it is 50 days after the the Passover. The word 50 days is the word Pentecost, and that's why we call it Pentecost today. But it's 50 days, and it's to celebrate the grain offering, right? It's to celebrate the spring season has come in, it's done, the crops are ready, and now they are celebrating what God has done. And so we see this Feast of Weeks or Pentecost. It goes by different names in different places in Scripture, but it's all the same. But notice that it's celebrated with a grain offering, with a burnt offering, a drink offering, a food offering, a sin offering, a peace offering, a wave offering. There's a lot that goes into Pentecost, because it's when the crop comes in, it's the ultimate being thankful to God for all that He has done. And it ends with a holy convocation in verse 21, a holy assembly. Then starting in verse 23, we start with our fifth feast, but there's a kind of a dividing line here in the calendar. These are what we would call the fall festivals or the fall feasts, right? So up until this point, everything has been in the spring. Now we move to the fall, and we start with the Feast of Trumpets. And basically, it's one day where they would blow the trumpets, where they call it today kind of New Year. It's kind of Rosh Hashanah. That's what they call it today. It's just the idea of one day of basically saying it's an extra Sabbath day. Right? Sabbaths are always on the seventh day. And so for Jews, that starts on Friday evening and goes to Saturday evening. But here, this is one day that moves with the calendar that is an extra Sabbath, a day to just be grateful of who God is, and He's given you another year. Number 6 is the Day of Atonement, which we read back in chapters 16 and 17. But you have the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. But notice the language here. This is a day that it uses this word afflict. And we talked about this on the Day of Atonement. The word afflict means to humble. It doesn't mean to hurt yourself. It means to humble yourself. And so this is a day that the people of Israel would humble themselves. And it even goes so far, it says, for whoever is not afflicted, whoever does not humble themselves, shall be cut off from his people, shall be put out. And if somebody works on this day, God says, I will destroy him. So this is a very holy, sacred day, because this is the one day where God meets with Israel, right? And all of the sin of Israel is atoned for, and the scapegoat is let go, right? Remember that day. And then we come to number 7. One of my favorite feasts in Scripture. We see it throughout, and Jesus does a whole lot on these festivals. It is known as the Feast of Booths, or also known as the Tabernacle Feast. It is not necessarily the tabernacle, the tent, but it means that they would build these booths. And so basically what happens, it's a 7-day feast, and people would have to live outside of their houses. Even today, if you go to Israel, or if you know Jews even in America, they will do this. They will build a shelter on the outside of their house. And they will eat in these shelters. They'll have supper time in these shelters. They will celebrate Passover or Sabbath in these shelters. And it's just a way of them to memorialize that God led them from Egypt, and from Egypt to Sinai. While they were at Sinai for that year, they were living in tents, but God has something greater for them. God is not going to leave them in tents. There's something more. But notice, even in the tabernacle, we have the food offering, the burnt offering, the grain offering, the drink offering. They're even supposed to bring their vow offerings and free will offerings within those 7 days. So there's a whole lot that goes on in this. And for 7 days, they dwell in booths, remembering that God brought them out, but God has something better for them. And so this is, once again, just a calendar, and there will be more added, right? This is just while Moses is alive. There will be more feasts that God will add. as time goes on. This is just a calendar event that would be just a moment for Israel to remember what God has done, what he is doing, and what he is going to do. And so you would ask yourself, where's Jesus in this? Well, if you read the Gospels, Jesus celebrates all of these feasts. He does lots of things in these feasts, but one of my favorite stories is during the Feast of the Booths, or the Feast of the Tabernacles. The priest would go all the way down to the pool of Siloam, and he would dip into a golden pitcher, fill it up with water, and he would walk it all the way back up into the temple, in which he would pour into a basin in the temple. And everybody would line the streets on the last day of the Feast of the Tabernacles to watch this water come up, about a 2-mile trek, coming up and up and up into Jerusalem, into the temple. And this is the same day where Jesus stands at the top of that, at the inside of the temple, and he says, "I am the living water. Whoever drinks of me will never thirst," giving semblance that he is God and that he can give something that nobody else can give. And so Jesus interacts a lot with these feasts, but these are special moments that you need to know, because as you read through Scripture, a lot of things will happen on these holidays or on these feasts, and it will bring significance back to the original point of why they're doing these feasts. I hope that makes sense. We'll see you tomorrow in chapter 24. God bless.